Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for the first patch of the mid-set 11.15. A lot has changed with the introduction of the mid-set. New traits, champions, and mechanics that have had a large influence on the meta. Because of that, we want to be clear that today's top 5 is likely going to change over the course of the patch. Players are still figuring out what works and what doesn't. With all that said, we'll be covering 5 of the current compositions doing well in the meta. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. At the top of the list, we have YASUO coming in as the number 5 composition. First off, let's just make it clear, this is a relatively controversial pick for the top 5 because it's not a composition played all that often. The state of YASUO was left in question with the removal of Dragon Slayer, as that was the primary way YASUO was played previously. Because of that and the fact that this build isn't played all that often, you may wonder why it's in the top 5 at all. The main reason is Cavaliers. Cavaliers have taken over the meta with several compositions utilizing them. Due to the trait being a damage reduction, it's difficult for most forms of damage to hurt them. Even items like Last Whisper, which are useful against Cavaliers, don't inherently help against the mitigation Cavaliers have. Thus, we turn to one source of damage that is basically unblockable, true damage. That's where YASUO slides into the spotlight, as he's one of the only consistent sources of true damage. Not the only one, mind you, but as far as carries go, he's the best. But just having true damage isn't quite enough. What build do you go now that Dragon Slayers are gone? The build popping up the most right now with YASUO is 4 Nightbringer, 3 Sentinel, 3 Skirmisher. The core composition is YASUO, Lee Sin, Diana, Sejuani, Irelia, Olaf, and Galio. At level 8, you can add in whatever you want, though Rel is a common addition for more CC and survivability. Irelia is the key champion here, as she provides Legionnaire for YASUO while also being a Sentinel and Skirmisher. This isn't quite as much damage as the old Dragon Slayer composition, but it has a lot of frontline to buy time for YASUO to burn through the enemy frontline. Items are important here as well, with RFC being the number 1 must-have for YASUO. Not only does it remove the annoying melee pathing, it also lets him attack the frontline from relative safety. Hand of Justice is also much better after the rework, making it an ideal item for YASUO. Lastly, any additional damage items helps a lot, like a Jeweled Gauntlet, or you can add in a little bit of AoE with Runins. At the end of the day, the composition is still being figured out, so there's a lot to explore when it comes to the strongest board and best items. What hasn't changed is you still want YASUO 3, otherwise scaling into the late game is unlikely to happen. Let's move on to the composition coming in at number 4, Assassin Revenant. The mid-set brought a lot of changes to Assassins. There were some buffs to the champions, but they also lost both Katarina and LeBlanc and only got Pyke in return. Because of that change, it's left Assassins entirely dependent on Nocturne as the main carry. Sure, Viego can do well late game, but he's not a carry. Luckily for Nocturne, they also added in another Revenant, Fiddlesticks. Because of that, you can easily run 4 Assassin for a Revenant composition to boost Nocturne in all the right ways. And emblems aren't all that uncommon, so being able to transition into 6 Assassin is definitely doable. Overall, Assassins are easy to run. Pick up Nocturne with 3 other Assassins and toss in Revenants for frontline. Roll at 7 or 8 to find Nocturne 3, and you're good to go. Of course, there's plenty of nuance to the composition, but at its core, the build is simple. Keep in mind that if you're committing to Nocturne, you will need the 3-star him, otherwise your board won't scale well in the late game. As for items, Last Whisper is a must-have. Ironclad is super popular as well as other forms of damage reduction, so having Last Whisper makes an unkillable board a little bit closer to killable. Vernon's Hurricane is also a best-in-slot item for Nocturne, as it helps spread out his damage outside of the melee range. The last item can be flexible, with Deathblade being the most common, though Infinity Edge or even another Runins are viable options. In general, the goal with Assassins is to aim for a top 4 and maybe squeeze into the top 2 if you hit all of your upgrades. Up next, we have APHELIOS as the number 3 composition. APHELIOS is doing quite well for himself after the major changes he received in the mid-set patch. They changed him from being a consistent damage dealer to relying more on burst damage with his ability. In addition to that, they also brought in the new 5-cost champion Action, who provides armor reduction so you don't have to use an item slot on APHELIOS. Okay, so APHELIOS is doing well, but what build works the best for him? There's actually a lot of ways that you can use APHELIOS. The most common are 2 Rangers with a bunch of utility synergies and frontliners. That board at level 8 is Aphelios, Action, Rel, Sejuani, Gwen, Fiddlesticks, Ivern, and Volibear. This provides the Nightbringer trait for Aphelios, armor reduction and backline damage with Action, Mystic with Fiddle and Gwen, and a whole lot of frontline between the Cavaliers and Revenants. But that's not the only way that you can play Aphelios. 6 Nightbringer is also a viable option and gives you extra damage so you're not entirely reliant on Aphelios. And then there's also 4 Rangers, a less common comp to be sure, but still viable nonetheless. All in all, there's quite a few options if you do want to play Aphelios. As for items, you should make sure you have at least Rageblade for Aphelios. The stacking attack speed helps him a lot in getting multiple casts off per fight. Deathblade adds a lot of extra damage and plays into the same theme for stacking. Last Whisper is valuable but not entirely necessary if you find Action. This means your last item can be flexible. Even Shojin becomes a viable option since it helps with casting more per fight. At the end of the day, the issues for Aphelios are still similar. You need to 2-star him, meaning going fast level 8 is ideal. So if you have a weak mid-game and can't do that, playing Aphelios is much harder to do. Another issue right now is Cavaliers, as Aphelios will struggle to kill that front line. But all those potential issues aside, Aphelios is one of the more consistent carries in the current meta. Moving along, the number 2 composition is Lucian. Lucian is one of the new champions added in the Dawn of the Heroes mid-set patch. He comes dashing in with the 2 new traits, Sentinel and Cannoneer. Lucian also fills an interesting role as a 4-cost carry as he does both AD and magic damage. Since Lucian is still new, there's a lot of playable composition using him as the main carry. The most obvious one is 6 Sentinel, which is made easier by the fact that Senna is also a Cannoneer. Don't get caught buying into the vertical trait hype because 3 Sentinel is often better than 6 as it allows you to flex in other traits. That said, any composition using Lucian should always have at least 3 Sentinel and 2 Cannoneers. Sentinel provides an attack speed buff, and Cannoneer makes Lucian's ability do a lot more damage. With that in mind, you can run practically any composition with Lucian and Senna as the foundation. Need frontline? Play Cavaliers or Revenants. Action is a perfect 3rd Sentinel as he provides armor reduction. Toss in Garen for magic resist shred, or a Heimerdinger for extra magic damage. The sky's the limit for Lucian carry, at least for now, while players are still figuring out the best way to play him. Now for items. Lucian is weird in that you want AD items since his ability scales with attack damage, even though it does magic damage. Deathblade is the best choice here since the more stacks you get, the more damage his ability does. Last Whisper is helpful, but playing Action is generally enough armor reduction. Hand of Justice is generally preferred since Lucian will heal a lot with it, since he does both types of damage. One of the more unique items to use on Lucian is Warmogs. The reason is due to how Sentinel works, which provides the shield and attack speed buff at the beginning of combat to the champion with the highest health, hence Warmogs. This is important for Lucian because attack speed also increases the number of shots his ability does, adding an extra layer of synergy between his trait and ability. Overall, Lucian is likely the most consistent 4-cost carry in the current meta. That may change over the course of the patch, but for now, he should be capable of earning consistent top 4 placements. And the number 1 composition for the first patch of the mid-set, Forgotten Cavaliers. This composition came charging out of nowhere as it was relatively absent in the first few days of the patch, and then suddenly it blew up and it's everywhere now. Part of that is players getting used to the meta, but also with Abomination falling out of favor after the nerfs, it left the perfect spot open for an easy-to-play comp like Cavaliers. The heart of the composition is Hecarim. Hecarim with defensive items, Cavalier, and Forgotten is one tough guy to deal with for most compositions. The damage reduction, his healing, and the addition of Radiant items has helped a lot in propelling this composition to the top. On top of that, there's also a solid backline carry with Misfortune that adds both AoE damage and healing reduction. Alright, so the build itself. Basically, you hit level 6 and find Hecarim, Thresh, Misfortune, and one other Forgotten plus Sejuani and another Cavalier, preferably Rel. From there, you can go to level 7 if you want, or roll for Hecarim 3 and Misfortune 3. That's it. Okay, there's more to it than that, but with that board, you're going to be plenty strong to go into the late game as long as you hit Hecarim 3 with defensive items. Speaking of items, you can play quite a few on Hecarim. Bramble Vest is by far the best way to reduce damage taken from critical hits. Radiant versions of Bramble Vest and Warmogs are fantastic choices as well. Misfortune should have Shojin, Jeweled Gauntlet, and Archangel Staff to maximize your damage output. Overall, the core idea behind this composition is having an unkillable frontliner, Hecarim. Achieve this with items, Cavalier, Forgotten, and 3-starring him. Your chance of placing in the top 2 is quite high. Alright, that's it for our first top 5 compositions of the mid-set. But before we go, we have a few honorable mentions to talk about. The first honorable mention is, you guessed it, Abomination. Abomination absolutely dominated the first day of the mid-set. Composition and trait was so strong that they hot-fixed it soon after. After the nerfs, the strength of the composition certainly went down, though a large reason we're seeing it less is due to the popularity of Cavaliers and the knee-jerk reaction to a sudden nerf. The question then, is Abomination still playable? Yes, but it's not S tier anymore. Think of it more as an A tier composition that you can play when you have a good opening for it. A good opening for it is either early Abomination or early Draconic. Both of those openings let you transition into the mid game with a decent board that you can then either pivot out of or keep going into the late game. Our recommendation is don't focus too much on the nerfs and instead try out the build. If you do, you'll likely find it still works well enough for a top 4. Our next honorable mention is less of a specific composition and instead revolves around playing a capped late game board. What we mean by this is hitting level 8 or 9 and playing a bunch of 5 costs together. Generally Heimerdinger is the carry along with Teemo as backup damage. Toss in Ivern for Invoker with Fiddle and Volibear for Revenant. Gwen is also a great late game addition both for the inanimate trait and for being a Mystic. Let's make it clear that while this late game board is very strong, it's very difficult to get as well. But because it's so strong, it's worth making it into our honorable mentions. Generally, the best way to get to the late game capped board is having a strong mid game, which often involves high rolling. Regardless of how you get there, the chances of winning the lobby with a capped late game board is quite high. Alright, that's it for today's video, folks. We want to reiterate our original disclaimer. The meta is still being figured out. The top 5 compositions we have on today's list may change tomorrow or even next week. So keep that in mind while playing and don't be afraid to experiment with different comps. Let us know in the comment section below which compositions you're having the most success with in your ranked climb. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Future Giant Slayer TFT videos.